Welcome, friends. My name is Maddie Rose. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Education Program Coordinator here at Pendle Hill. And it is my honor to introduce you to our 2025 December First Monday Lecture. Thank you all for being here. We're joined by quite a full room here at Upmeads at Pendle Hill, and over 100 folks on Zoom. So the camera's there and they're all joining us. So hello on Zoom and hello to future folks who may be watching this recording. Pendle Hill is located on Lenape land on what is now known as Wallingford, Pennsylvania. As many of you know, since 1930, Pendle Hill has been an experiment in spiritual learning communities. Hello to our leaders, to our alumni, and to those who are new to us tonight. And hello again to everyone on Zoom. Thank you for being here. Before we get into the program, I wanted to go over a few logistical and technical details. So I'm joined tonight by Pendle Hill staff and guests, including Emily Savin here, David. Oh, David is here. Thank you. David was helping make sure folks got here. And then our colleague Francis, who is joining us remotely and making everything possible online. And sharing. Oh, yes, here's everyone. Great. Hello. Also just a note for folks here in Upmeads that there are beverages and warm water out there, and there's also a restroom should you need it. For those of us joining on Zoom, if you have any technical difficulties or questions, you can message asterisk tech support, and that's Francis, and they'll do their best to support you. We are live streaming this to YouTube, but only those speaking will be live streamed. And in the follow-up email that I will be sending to all folks who registered, you will receive a link to the recording of the lecture, and you can also find it on our YouTube channel. We also have closed captioning, so you can enable that on your device. And at the end of the lecture, we will have an opportunity for question and answer, both from folks here in Upmeads as well as those on Zoom. We are especially grateful to Friends Foundation for the Aging, whose support to Pendle Hill allows us to continue making our First Monday Lecture series and our other online offerings free to friends of all ages. And now I am delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Erica Canela is an early modern social historian with a focus on 17th century English Quaker history and the psychological trauma shaped by the British Civil Wars. Erica holds a PhD from the University of Birmingham, where she also serves as an honorary research fellow. She prides herself on writing history that is highly accessible through deeply researched and spellbinding storytelling. Erica lives in North Somerset, England, with her husband Neil and their very cool cat, Alex. So now I will invite us back into a few moments of silence, and Erica will begin her lecture as you are led.
I feel ready. I feel ready for this. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was very lovely. It is such a privilege to be here. And I'm so delighted that so many people are joining on Zoom. And I'm honestly astonished to see so many people here in person because it is bitterly cold. And so I cannot thank you enough for braving the elements to be here this evening. So as I was introduced, I am an early modern Quaker historian. And so this is my chosen vocation. This is my life's work. And so I am frequently asked two questions. The first question is, are you a Quaker? The answer is no, but I am a fan. I am a fan. The second question is, why Quakers? It's a good question. It's an excellent question, in fact. I'm from Central Delaware, And so I grew up sort of knowing about William Penn. I knew about Quakers, but I had no idea how this was going to completely change my life. And so years ago, I was looking for a PhD topic. I am a social historian. I like looking at everyday people and their very human experiences. And so my potential PhD supervisor said to me, "Oh, have you thought about Quaker history?" And I said, "Oh no, thank you. That doesn't sound interesting at all, at all." And so he said, "Well, you know what? Just do a little bit of reading and then get back to me." And I did. And I could not believe what I read. It was page turning. It was like there were these people, these radical histories. It was totally not what I was expecting at all. And so years later, well, here I am. Here I am, always evangelizing about early Quaker history. And so, as a historian, and especially as a Quaker historian, I want to challenge what you think of when you think of 17th century Quakers. At this moment, you may be thinking about William Penn. He looms large in this area, and rightfully so. For those who are sort of maybe not Quakers and are just kind of here to hang out, you may also be thinking about oatmeal right now. I realize this. And this is an uphill battle I must climb as an early modern Quaker historian. Really, really clever 19th century American marketing. So this is a complex story about a complex period of history. The 1650s remain, but it's my favorite decade of English history. Nothing for me even comes close. This decade, it was the very definition of adaptation, trial and error, confusion, a bit of fear, and a lot of change. And that's before we even throw religion into the mix. So this evening, we are looking at radical early Quakers. Who were they? What they did? And how on earth did they survive the 1650s? So the early Quakers, their story challenged everything that I was expecting, like I said. Quakers have traditionally been on the progressive and correct side of history. And I say that knowing that this is a very, very Quaker audience, so make sure to get that in there. So at the very start, they were fiercely, unapologetically radical. But before we get to that, it's really important to set the scene. Quakers did not just spring up out of nowhere. For all intents and purposes, Quakerism began in 1652 in Lancashire, England. But all of the pieces started coming together long before that, so 10 years, in fact. So as a public historian, normally when I give talks, I spend a lot of time on the British Civil Wars, otherwise known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms as well. Many early Quaker converts began their journey of religious descent on the battlefields. The Civil Wars, they would not only shape political futures, but also fundamentally change the social, cultural, and religious landscape during much of the 1640s and 1650s. So when talking about the Civil Wars, I look at the impact of trauma and how it essentially created a surprisingly willing and engaged audience for the earliest traveling Quaker ministers. The Civil Wars, they played a crucial role in shaping everything that followed. To understand early Quakerism, it is essential to consider the political and religious contexts that preceded it. The turmoil, instability, and psychological effects of these wars fostered an atmosphere where new movements like Quakerism could emerge. The background was pivotal for the earliest Quaker success, so their story has to begin here. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. So I I am a big fan of the film Cromwell from 1970. I don't know if you've seen it or not. So I'll be honest, this is the first time I'm talking about sort of civil wars to an predominantly American audience. And so I realize that there's Britain did civil wars first. And just as bloody, just as the casualties, the deaths, just as harrowing as what would follow in the US years later. So anyway, back to Cromwell. So if you haven't seen it, it's a really good introduction to the 1640s. So it's a film about Oliver Cromwell. Hey, we guessed it, right? And Charles I. And so here we have two true powerhouse performances from Sir Alec Guinness and Richard Harris. Next slide, please. There we go. So what I found most striking about this film were the battle scenes. So we have these grand sweeping shots of English countryside. These were actually filmed in Spain. But you have soldiers fighting soldiers. It's beautiful cinematography. And you could believe this is what the wars were like. But this, of course, was not the reality. The civil wars were total, impacting communities and everyday people in very painful and tangible ways. So as a historian of the earliest Quakers, I often find myself thinking, why? Why did these people risk everything? What was it about these ideas that was so appealing? Especially when the walls started closing in and authorities became less tolerant of the Quakers' disruptive and sometimes weird behavior. So I believe that the despair, confusion, chaos, and destruction from the civil wars is the key to understanding the early success of the movement. So we'll start by looking at the lived experience of war and how it was reported in the printed press and by people on the ground. So the printed press and propaganda played a very important role. And this matters because early Quakers used this brilliantly later on. So we're going to have a look at a couple of war illustrations published at the time. Next slide, please. So this is a really famous image, World Turned Upside Down. So I know you are reading Christopher Hill's World Turned Upside Down at the moment. And so this is the original World Turned Upside Down. And I've always been fascinated by this image. For me, this is the perfect example of a picture stating 1,000 words. It's famous for a reason. It is so compelling. And so it's a little bit small here, but it is literally, it is showing a world turned upside down. And so for me, it's not super clear here, but there are mice chasing cats, cats chasing dogs. Obviously, this chap here is wearing his trousers, I guess it's a top, and you get what's happening here. The fish are in the sky, the horse is drawing the cart, and the church. This is my favorite bit. The church is upside down in the corner. But provocative. I like it. Next slide. So this is another image from the world. Back one, please. There we go. So this image equally fascinates me because of the brutality. I feel like this is a very gory and kind of accurate representation of the experience of wars. And so you see the people, things are not going well for the people of this town. So we have sort of people on spikes. I think she may be about to lose her head. It's just not great. So let me see. You can't be an author of a book and not read from the book at an event. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you can just indulge me for a moment here. So this is another sort of, again, sort of that on the ground reporting of the wars. So this is a quote. So what frequent alarms we gave them by fireballs, lights upon our steeple, by dogs, cats, and outworn horses, having light matches tied about them, and turned out upon their works, whereby we put the enemy in such distraction that sometimes they charged one another. So these words, they're providing us with quite a searing image, a visual image. And I think it's kind of the way it's described, you can hear it. Like you can hear the just awfulness of it. But it's also, I think you can quite acutely smell that quote. So from the start of the conflict, innocent people, like these folks here, were being directly impacted, and the psychological warfare would continue and develop over the next 9 years. It was largely, the civil wars, the British civil wars, were largely a struggle between two competing armies, fighting occasional battles, and settling up scores of garrison bases. Life could be made hellish by soldiers in search of supplies and the greed of marauders in search of plunder. Local people were often at the mercy of these traveling field armies. They were expected to shelter and feed soldiers, as well as their horses. In communities that were dependent on agriculture, feeding horses could potentially destroy crops for an entire season, and the damage caused by soldiers just trampling through fields, plundering crops, livestock, other produce. You can see how it could just be absolutely just detrimental to these people on the ground. Soldiers were accused of serious offenses, and the constant presence of troops would have caused grave concern and fear. There was also disruption to other trade as shops were again plundered and craftsmen were forced to give soldiers their raw material and tools. Many residents, they took shelter inside the city walls, or they just moved elsewhere. But those who could not leave, sometimes they could face total devastation. But then you could also leave the city for what you think is safety, only to find chaos there as well. There was an expectation that innocent people would be killed or their lives destroyed. Particularly in the garrison towns and cities, the day-to-day unrest and instability was devastating. A decade of war, nearly a decade of war, would unavoidably have its casualties, both in terms of bloodshed and religious observance. See, we're getting there. We're getting there. For those who lived through the destruction, looting, and disorder, the civil wars were a life-changing experience. The war-weary people found themselves in a crisis of faith, often encouraged by radicalized traveling preachers. As a consequence of war, the instability of the state church in the 1640s left the casual layperson with the freedom to subscribe to new and sometimes radical ideas. As the wars progressed, the soldiers in the New Model Army, which was certainly the parliamentarian side of this conflict, they disseminated ideas of obscure radical groups that were scattered up and down the kingdom. So during the wars, access to the printing press became significantly more widespread. Pamphlets allowed people to engage with political and religious propaganda. And not only the debates between royalists and parliamentarians, but also addressing fundamental issues of mid-17th century society, including new religious ideas. So it was a full-blown spiritual revolution. Groups sprang up like mushrooms after the rain, each claiming divine insight, each challenging the old order. So I'm just going to go, there's not a slide for this. I thought there was, but I remember there's not. So I'm just going to sort of do a little roll call of some of the other radical groups that are popping up in the 1640s that are predating our Quakers. So Seekers, so they're going to be very important later on. So Seekers they're pretty skeptical of all organized religion and believed that churches and clergy were not necessary and that God could speak to individuals directly. As I said, a lot of Seekers are going to end up joining the Quakers in the 1650s. Spoiler alert, they're very important. Baptists formed some of the earliest dissenting congregations in England. They were often associated with the New Model Army, serving as chaplains and soldiers. They believed that the true church was made of voluntary communities of the faithful, not state institutions. So in the 1640s, two groups of Baptists emerged. General Baptists, who believed in free will and that Christ died for everyone, and particular Baptists believed in predestination and that Christ only died for the elected few. Fifth monarchists believed that Christ was returning real soon. They were politically aggressive and wanted to establish a theocratic government to prepare for the return of Jesus Christ. Ranters, personal favorite of mine, they were just spiritual anarchists, really. They believed that those in touch with the divine were no longer bound by biblical or human laws. So they rejected sin and advocated for a bit of a kind of everything goes situation, which was deeply unpopular. There were also some high-profile political radicalism at this time. And so it's certainly worth mentioning to sort of give a full picture of this sort of radical landscape that's all happening in wartime as well. So levelers believed in popular sovereignty, equality for men before the law, and religious toleration. Diggers referred to themselves as true levelers and widely known as proto-communists. They advocated for the abolition of private property and common ownership of the land and resources. So with all of this choice, and I know that that's not even giving, I mean, it's not even Cliff's Notes version of that. Like that was so entirely short. But you can kind of get the idea that there's a lot of choice. And there's also this desire for a new identity, be it religious or political. That desire was really growing. So the Civil Wars managed to take a dislocated world and connect it and spread ideas through preaching and the printed press. Dissenting groups were able to articulate their views to an audience that was dissatisfied and deeply damaged by the impact of war. So you can imagine how people were feeling when the first traveling ministers really began their work in 1654. I know you're thinking, Erica, you have been talking for a while now, and we have barely hit on the Quakers. Now is the time. So this is a population that is still vulnerable and still recovering from nearly a decade of conflict. There had to be lingering feeling of uncertainty and fear. This is a population that needed something to believe in, something that made sense in a world that was increasingly uncertain. Maybe even something that would give them their own power back. Next slide, please. Yes, Quakers, woo! So the Quakers tapped into this dissatisfaction and uncertainty of the period and spread their message with zeal, prolific writing, and a gifted traveling ministry. We know this, right? We know this. So the desire, so I said that there's this desire for a new religious identity is growing, and Quakerism was viewed by some as an attractive alternative to the state church. So it was packaged, the Quaker message was packaged in a way that resonated in these war-torn communities. Quakers would eventually establish meetings in every English county by the end of the century, which is a tribute to the enthusiasm of the missionaries and the organizational skill of the first Quakers. I will go on and on about how in awe I am of their organization forever. These widespread meetings, they demonstrated the efficacy of their message and acceptance by local groups, as well as the effectiveness of the leaders sent to propagate the Quaker message. You also have to bear in mind that in the 17th century, the overall number of Quakers peaked at 60,000 in England and Wales by 1680, or 1.15% of the population. They were successful. So there were a few key individuals setting the Quaker foundation at the onset. But for the sake of this talk, let's talk about George Fox, who, for all intents and purposes, this may be a controversial take, I'm going there, for all intents and purposes, was the founding father of Quakerism. Next slide. So there he is. I love this portrait. I'm a real big fan of Quaker hats. This is one of my favorite George Fox hat moments. So George Fox was born in the village of Drayton in the Clay, which is now known as Fenny Drayton in Leicestershire in July 1624. Honestly, last year was a big year for George Fox. At the age of 19 in 1643, Fox left his family and began a period of traveling. He wrote that he was plagued by the temptations of sin and despair and found no solution in any of the religious options of the day. This sort of autobiographical writing I love this about the earliest Quakers, is that when they write about themselves and they write about their upbringing, they are always the most miserable. They are so unhappy. They are just constantly moping around. It's one of these, it's just kind of it's a common narrative, I think, certainly among the first Quakers. So, he's leading the way. So as George Fox is traveling, he felt most at home amongst the dissenting people, particularly the General Baptists, and as he traveled, he remained within regions controlled by parliamentary forces. And so I often say that George Fox, sort of, interesting chap, he basically took a gap year during the civil wars and sort of traveling around, amongst these armies that are in parliamentary control, which, when you are led by the Spirit to go traveling, you go. It doesn't matter what's happening. So during the late 1640s, Fox had several significant religious experiences that he regarded as divine revelations, because of course he did. So these experiences prompted his public ministry, which began in the Midlands and Yorkshire in 1647. So during this period, Fox began his practice of entering churches to dispute with the clergy. Unsurprisingly, he was attacked by mobs of local people when preaching. In 1650, he was imprisoned for blasphemy in Derby. He was offered a captaincy in the army in exchange for his freedom, but he declined, claiming he fought with spiritual weapons, not outward ones. So George Fox, in this very early period, he recruited very important early Quaker preachers at the onset. And his mission to the north of England from 1651 to 1652 was overwhelmingly successful because his message was acceptable to pre-existing congregations of religious dissenters, like seekers. Next slide, please. So what are Quakers? What are they? What are early Quakers believing in? What is so hot? What is so hot about this message? So there was an early rejection of church hierarchy. Fox and the earliest converts preached that true worship did not require buildings, ostentatious ornaments, or ordained ministry. They refused to take oaths because they felt that by always speaking the truth, there was no need. And more importantly, in swearing an oath, they would disobey Christ, who said, "Swear not at all," in the book of Matthew. Quakers they can always back everything up with scripture. And I do really admire that. Every single thing, they could back it up. So this always speaking the truth. So not swearing oaths, this all ties to the belief that all were equal before God. Quakers observed that when oaths were required before local authorities and the courts, it demonstrated an inequality amongst men. So arguably, this might be the most controversial thing that Quakers did in this very early period. So they refused to remove their hats to social superiors. This was the custom in the 17th century. You just did it. Quakers were like, no. This was another demonstration of social hierarchy that they wholeheartedly rejected. They're also not paying tithes because they're not interested in supporting that corrupt church. Quakers did not, as I said, they did not require a priest or an intermediary. because they had direct access to God and they could share in Christ's perfection. And their word for this experience, as we know, is called the light. So the idea of a light within each person was a radical notion that everyone had the freedom to communicate with God when and wherever they pleased. The freedom to choose also meant that it was part of a message that needed to be shared as widely as possible. Quakerism would not have survived without the foresight and capability to take the message further afield. They were organized from the start. So the Quaker message, who is this appealing to? Well, it may have appealed to those who felt excluded in the community or parish malcontents who were intrigued by the bold and confrontational style of the earliest Quakers. We will get to that very shortly. However, its viability as a religious community stemmed not only from the message being conveyed, but also the way that it was introduced. Fox was a spark. He was a spark lighting the way. And people would abandon their leaders to follow new prophets like George Fox and others, who provided a vision of an alternative, seemingly better future. So I think, again, sorry, I do really hammer this point. I think that Fox and Margaret Fell were masterminds of organizing and packaging this message in a way that made it irresistible to those looking for an alternative. Now, writing was not an inherent part of being a Quaker, but it certainly contributed to the movement's growth during the early 1650s, and it played an important practical role in the establishment of Quaker ministry. So it is estimated that about 100 Quaker authors had their writings published by 1656, contributing to a total of 291 publications, which is quite impressive considering that things don't really start taking off until 1652. So papers, letters, printed tracts, they could be more widely dispersed than oral preaching. And like preaching, the purpose of publishing was to convince potential followers by publicizing their cause to the outside world. And this is how many people would have first noticed Quakers, reading about them or having their work read to them. In addition to printed materials, early friends were zealous and in many cases compelled to abandon their lives, completely uproot their lives to spread the message. So for Quakers, traveling ministers played an important role. Anyone, man or woman, could speak in a meeting for worship if they felt divinely prompted to do so. This was so radical for the time. Women preaching, oh, get out of here with that heresy. No good. But the Quakers were like, you know what? Let's go. So the aims of these early Quaker missionaries, the aim was to establish meetings and offer spiritual leadership and particularly fellowship. Taking their early message to towns and villages, seeking out hospitable groups, and drawing widespread skepticism and hostility. The road is where their message evolved and developed. So Quakers wrote about large meetings with eager audiences and ministers that convinced many to join. This was a carefully crafted narrative that unfurled from the leadership downward and across the country. The hope for the traveling ministers was that converts would then carry on the message and the movement would grow and multiply within that community and beyond. On the ground, the missionaries gave notice of their impending visit, if possible, to let word of mouth generate interest, which would then, of course, draw a crowd for a meeting. In most cases, these meetings were held in a local residence or an open space. So we have roughly established what Quakers believed in, and that they were big fans of writing, and they very quickly established a powerful and persuasive traveling ministry. Now, I am going to shock you and you to your very core right now. The local authorities really did not like the Quakers. I know. Why? Well, they were constantly breaking the law. In the 1650s, which is a period we're mostly looking at this evening, Most Quakers were arrested for refusing to swear any oath, speaking to the priest, and for interrupting church services. It was mostly their tendency to disrupt church services and their confrontational style of preaching. Their refusal to remove hats proved a step too far for many in places of authority. And in many cases, it was their refusal to swear any oath that made it very easy for these annoyed judges to throw them into prisons. So Quakers had natural opponents like Richard Baxter, minister of St. Mary's Church in Kidderminster, Worcestershire. Baxter was a prominent Puritan minister, theologian, and prolific writer. He was an easy target for the earliest Quakers in person and in print. So Baxter saw Quakers as a threat to social order and a contaminating influence on society. So he wrote, "The worst of all is that they behave themselves like malignant enemies to the very cause and church and gospel and servants of Jesus Christ. Most of them that I have seen have an altered countenance, looking upon every man that they suspect to be a minister or friend of ministry with such detestation and hatred. Their very design, religion, and work is to make people hate the ministers and revile them as they do." He was not alone. The famous diarist John Evelyn was even more pronounced in his judgments, writing in 1656 that the Quakers were a new fanatic sect of dangerous principles. They do not show respect to any man, magistrate, or other, and seem a melancholy, proud sort of people. Richard Baxter, he is tired of them. Richard Baxter said, "No man of reason should be a Quaker, considering that among those scraps of their religion which is made known, there is much notorious falsehood and ungodliness." Now, Baxter tried to reason with them. It was Baxter's belief that Quakers were unable to fully grasp the consequences of their actions against the church and ministry. So he requested an audience with the Quakers to answer their questions in person, but they refused. And he wrote, "But have you not betrayed your deceitfulness in refusing to consent that I should come and answer your questions? Why would you send me queries which you would not give me leave to answer by speech? What is it that you feared?" So rather than allow him to attend their meeting, the Quakers attended Baxter's service in Kidderminster with the intention to make a disturbance. And this just continues. Baxter's annoyance with Quakers was palpable from the onset as he lamented. He has got so many great quotes. So Baxter says, "I find that they do so challenge and brag and triumph if we say nothing to them, and that too many simple people expect that we should answer them. If I say nothing, they will insult. If I write to them, they will print it. Being therefore so called to speak, I choose rather to print my own papers, how mean soever, than let them do it." Baxter addressed the friends as miserable creatures and immediately addressed the dunghill heaps of false accusations, writing, "Having received your first letters, almost nothing of some sheets of," these are some great early modern 17th century English insults. Here we go. "Sheets of, thou serpent, viper, thou child of the devil, thou son of perdition, thou dumb dog, thou false hireling, thou false liar, deceiver, greedy dog, thou ravening wolf, thou cursed hypocrite," with much more of the like. "I returned you no reply, as confessing myself not so well skilled in that language and learning as you are. Burn! For if I be a dumb dog, you cannot expect that I should equal you in snarling or barking or howling." Baxter's tone throughout is one of exasperation. The Quakers were accusing him of being a liar, a hypocrite, the spawn of Satan, and he was done with it. But he frequently engaged in printed debates with them. Baxter immediately recognized the need to suffocate what he saw as a threat to his ministry, his livelihood, and most importantly, to wider society. Through his position of authority, and Baxter's words, they transcend regional boundaries. Like he is a national figure, really. Baxter was able to exploit the threat that the earliest Quakers posed to his advantage. And to advance the position of the state church during his tenure in Kidderminster. So Baxter used his publications to deter his audience from joining the Quakers, because that would be a massive fail. That would be a massive fail for Richard Baxter. But he also was attempting to expose what he saw as their flawed beliefs and actions. It never seemed to occur to Quakers that congregations might find the disruption of their worship, of the state church worship or Baxter's services, offensive. That they might actually resent these strangers accusing their trusted minister as being a false teacher or being accused of living in Cain's nature in envy and malice. Local authorities responded quite fiercely, and you can understand why. The early Quakers seemed a bit determined to destroy the peace. These people lived through the civil wars. They weren't interested in fanatics disrupting this very delicate balance. So yes, Quakers were frequently imprisoned because they're breaking the law. People either found their message to be either compelling or repelling. For those that found it repelling, the ideas, the rejecting of societal norms, the rejection of church hierarchy, but it's also the way that this message is being spread. It was spread with real urgency. The early Quakers were not quietly making suggestions or shyly handing someone a pamphlet. They were bursting into church services, chastising the ministers. They're holding unlawful meetings. They're frequently arrested and imprisoned for breaking the law. And other things that sort of Quakers are doing, obviously we're going to sort of going into this direction now. So early Quakers, they also sometimes went naked in public as a prophetic sign. So this was dramatizing spiritual truths and rebuking social corruption. Nudity represented the spiritual nakedness of society, its sins laid bare before God. It was a way of exposing hypocrisy and warning of divine judgment. In 1652, so very, very early days, a Quaker woman walked naked into Whitehall Palace during a sermon before Oliver Cromwell's officers, crying out, "Resurrection, I am ready for thee." For Quakers, such shocking acts were not madness, but they were prophecy. These sorts of actions, they were meant to expose the nation's spiritual nakedness before God and call people to repentance. In Cambridgeshire, Quaker Thomas Ibbott started throwing money up and down the streets, half undressed. There are many cases of performative nudity in the 1650s and early 1660s. These Quakers, they believed that they were using their bodies as living protests against sin and corruption. So they're disrupting the peace in a big way. And these are communities that are still trying to make sense of everything happening in the mid-1650s. These rabble-rousers are disrupting the balance, that peace, in a way that is uncomfortable. It is unsettling. The earliest Quakers were so provocative. So I want to go back to we can go to the next slide, please. So this image is from sort of like my little intro image. So this is called The Quaker's Dream, and this was published in 1655. And so we can see, honestly, not a fan of Quakers here. So The Quaker's Dream, or the Devil's Pilgrimage in England, being an infallible relation of their several meetings, shriekings, shakings, quakings, roarings, yellings, howlings, tremblings in the bodies, and rising bellies, with a narrative of their strange doctrine, the strange and wonderful satanical apparitions, and the appearing of the devil unto them in the likeness of a black boar, a dog with a flaming eye, and a black man without a head, causing the dogs to bark, the swine to cry, and the cattle to run, to the great admiration of all that shall read the same. So one of my favorite fun facts about this particular pamphlet is that, so you've got these 4 images here, and it's basically, so we've got naked people here who said this as above ordinances. It's basically just a lot of ne'er-do-wells and naughty things happening. But these exact 4 images were used in a pamphlet that was published earlier that was called The Ranter's Ranting. And so we know that ranters are, they're kind of like, they're spiritual free-for-all, hey. And so early Quakers are being conflated with ranters. Both bad. Like this is not the kind of thing we want in society. I love that image. So I mean, ultimately, I love this subject because it's such a great story. And so with the time that I have remaining, I want to look at 2 incidents that took place within a few months of each other in 1656 and 1657. So I will say, and this is something I should have said at the very start of the presentation, and I'm very sorry that I didn't. So these stories, the second story, which I will get to in approximately, I would say about 5 minutes time, it does deal with suicide. So I do feel obliged to sort of just share that. So I'll do a symbol when it's time for that story. So I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier, but we carry on. Next slide, please. James Naylor. Who is James Naylor? So James Naylor was born in 1618 in Ardsley near Wakefield, Yorkshire. He was a farmer's son with a modest education who served as a parliamentarian soldier in the Civil Wars under General Thomas Fairfax. He left the army in the mid-1640s, struggling with spiritual unrest. He returned home from Yorkshire. Again, spiritual unrest, right? This common narrative, they're always miserable. So he returned home to Yorkshire, where he lived as a farmer. He became a spiritual seeker, withdrawing from organized religion and spending a lot of time reading the Bible. So he met George Fox in 1652 and was profoundly influenced by the Quaker message of inward light. It resonated with him deeply. He quickly became one of the most gifted and charismatic Quaker ministers, preaching widely across England, drawing large crowds. James Naylor was known for his powerful voice, mystical intensity, and ability to inspire deep devotion. Now, this might be a bit cringe to say, but I do think he was a bit of a rock star. He was viewed by some followers as a near Christ-like figure, which would lead to controversy. So by all accounts, Naylor was an extremely charismatic man and a great preacher. He attracted a loyal personal following, which troubled some other Quakers. Fox often expressed concern that Naylor was becoming overenthusiastic and erratic. And by 1656, they were hardly on speaking terms. Next slide, please. So, in October 1656, Naylor and his companions staged a demonstration that proved disastrous. They reenacted the arrival of Christ in Jerusalem. So Naylor rode on horseback into Bristol, which is nearby where I live, by the way, and he's attended by followers. You can see here who they're singing, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God of Israel." They strewed the muddy path with garments. So you might find this crazy, but he was arrested and charged with blasphemy. I know. The authorities did not let this one slide. So though Naylor denied that he was impersonating Jesus and said rather that Christ was in him, he refused to explain his actions, and the ecstatic devotion of his followers convinced many that he was the Messiah. Now, this is a side note I find quite interesting. So when he was arrested, he was carrying a copy of Epistle from Lentulus to the Roman Senate, and within its pages, it had a description of Jesus with his shoulder-length hair and short beard, which matched what Naylor was sporting. You can kind of see it in the image, certainly in the one before. So this case, so Naylor is arrested for blasphemy. This case immediately was tried in Parliament. Despite its lack of legal jurisdiction, this trial should have taken place in Bristol because that's where the crime was committed. So Naylor's trial dominated the sessions, which is not a surprise. This was the government's opportunity to demonstrate real power against this looming threat of Quakerism. In the trial itself, the testimony of some of his followers was unsurprisingly deeply damaging to his case, and it was exploited to the full by those who wanted to use the incident to attack Quakers more generally. So Dorcas Urbery, who's one of the women here, is the world's worst character witness. Unless you could come up with something better, please, if you can, I would love to know. Put it in the chat, talk to me afterwards if you can think of a worse character witness. So, Dorcas, love her, she testified that Naylor was the only begotten Son of God, and she knew no other Jesus and no other Savior. He is on trial for blasphemy. Please remember this. So she continued her testimony and claimed that Naylor had raised her from the dead. Her testimony was extremely unhelpful. So this incident, whole thing, encouraged sort of challenges to the protectorate, so Oliver Cromwell's governments, their policy of religious toleration. So Naylor was used by the Puritan majority in Parliament as an example to justify increased persecution and suppression of the troublesome Quaker sect. And you can kind of see where they're coming from. So this trial, Naylor's trial, lasted 13 days. So in the end, Parliament declared Naylor guilty of horrid blasphemy. Of course, that was coming, of course. And said that he was a grand impostor and a great seducer of the people. So the quote is that, so his sentence, December 16th, it was proposed that the punishment of James Naylor should be death. And the question being put, the noes went forth 96, the yeas 82, so passed in the negative. So he's not going to be executed. On the next day, the 17th, the House agreed to an amended sentence. This sentence was harsh. Next slide, please. You can see the short hair and the beard, the hair and the beard here quite clearly. So Naylor was first sentenced to be pilloried and whipped through the streets of London, and then pilloried again, and then to have his forehead branded with the letter B for blasphemer, and his tongue bored through with a hot iron, which you can see in this photo here, or image. Afterwards, he was to be sent back to Bristol, taken through the city on horseback, bareback, with his face backwards, and also publicly whipped. And then from there, sent back to the prison in Bridewell, London, and then restrained from society. So basically just sort of put into kind of solitary confinement, really. He's meant to be sort of there, like sentenced to essentially hard labor. And he was not allowed to have pen, ink, paper. And so obviously they're trying to just make sure that he doesn't have any way of communicating his prison life to the outside world. So the first round, which you can see here, saw Naylor so badly injured from the 310 lashes that petitions were presented to postpone the second round. At his second pillorying, 3 women grouped themselves around him in a way that evoked pictures of the 3 Marys of the Cross. Gals, you are not helping. So if Naylor was used as an example by Parliament of the dangers of where unfettered religious toleration would lead, it might also be argued that he was made a scapegoat by a Quaker movement that was just beginning a significant process of transition. Many argued that the Naylor affair revealed critical organizational weakness and a lack of discipline. This incident occurred at the start of quite a significant period of change for a Quaker movement, and obviously this is going to accelerate things a bit. So to the Quaker leadership, like Fox and Fell, Naylor stood for everything that they were trying to leave behind. This incident validated concerns and fears of their staunchest opponents, as it would. The impact of Bristol left a deep impression on Quakers, resulting in growing concerns for respectability and a fear of the chaos and ridicule brought by the uncontrolled spirit working within the individual. The late 1650s were a challenging period for Quakers, as they had to cope with intense periods of persecution, as well as having to self-censor members of their own community. But the trouble didn't stop with Naylor. There would be more blasphemous behavior making headlines. This is the incident I was talking about earlier, so the next case study, really. So one of the early Quaker incidents I've researched is a true, kind of, oh, wow, moment that for me transcends time. This case provided, again, those skeptical of Quakers and their assertions with evidence of their extreme actions. This case is the smorgasbord of weird. Next slide, please. So normally when I tell this story, I do like a very dramatic, it's kind of like an interpretive storytelling, but I'm just gonna use my voice to sort of do this time. So I'm gonna set the scene for you. So on Friday, the 20th of February, 1657, so this is just a few months after James Naylor, William Poole, a young apprentice, left his master's house in Worcester, saying that Christ had taken him by the hand and that he must go unto him. William Poole did not return. This behavior was very much out of character, and his employer, clothier and Quaker, George Knight, grew quite concerned. On Sunday morning, Poole's clothes were found on the banks of the River Severn, which is quite a significant river in this part of England. It's very in the city center. It's fairly wide. It's very fast, and as you can imagine, in February it would be very cold. So on Sunday morning, Poole's clothes were found on the banks of the River Severn, and his body was found floating in the river the next day. Poole was buried the following day in Claines, which is a small parish just north of the city center. So William Poole and George Knight were known Quakers, and there is no evidence to suggest that either of them were disruptive or deeply radical before the incident. But Poole's Quakerism was immediately seized on by the press. His reported actions on the day he disappeared suggest that he was experiencing a spiritual epiphany. With his last reported words being that Christ had to go with him, it's a natural conclusion to make. The coroner announced a verdict of suicide, and it is quoted that he was so full of pity as to exempt the dead body from that sentence to which those who do destroy themselves are liable. For he was not buried in the highway. He had no stake placed with iron thrust through his body to terrify all passengers from committing such a black and desperate act. But on the Monday following, about 4 o'clock in the morning, he was civilly buried in the parish of Claines. So while the coroner was full of pity, a suicide was a suicide, and those who committed this act were expected to be punished for going against God's law. It was, in the early modern period, it was the worst sort of bad death. It basically said that you have given way to the diabolical temptation of despair, where the desperate, abandoning all hope of God's mercy, condemn themselves. So if suicide was a heinous crime, why was Poole, who was guilty of such an offense, buried in the churchyard? Well, the national press ended up eating this story up, as you can imagine. as we progress, you'll see why they kind of took it up. So the story, it gets juicy and it gets even weirder. So it was said that there was considerable sympathy for Poole and his family, and he was buried without the stigma of suicide, which is a pretty big deal. So in one of the national papers, the author is anonymous author, wrote that Poole's mother was an honest and godly woman. So in addition to the issues that arose with the burial of the suicide, Poole was a known Quaker and thereby readily despised by authorities. So it seems likely that his family were not Quaker, and they persuaded the church to allow for his burial to take place. Because obviously at this time period, his interment in the churchyard went against the principles of Quakerism. So in this matter, it's also highly likely that his family made the decision quickly, without respecting the wishes of Poole's Quaker meeting. But this really isn't even the good stuff. So you gotta sort of hold your horses. We're going towards the end of our time together, and so I want to leave you on a high. So following his early morning burial in Plains, Poole's grieving mother was approached by a local Quaker, Susanna Pearson. Pearson offered to perform a miracle and bring her son back to life. In what must have been a moment of absolute desperation, Mrs. Poole accepted Pearson's unusual offer of divine intervention. Pearson obviously saw herself as a conduit between the divine and human. She was confident. You gotta love the confidence. Like, she was confident. She believed that the Holy Spirit was working through her and that she had the ability to do this. I do love that confidence. So in suitably dramatic fashion, Pearson's unnamed accomplices continued with the performance. So they go again under the cover of darkness and they dig up William Poole's freshly buried corpse. They bring him out. I mean, this is sacrilegious, unacceptable behavior, full stop. So Poole was buried in consecrated ground, and to be disturbed was a violation of all convention. It's just wrong on all the levels. So Poole's corpse was taken out of the grave and placed on the ground. The shroud was removed. So then she rubs his body. She sort of straddles his body. Oh, see, I'm always going to perform this because it's just, I just get into it. So she straddles his body, his corpse, and she starts rubbing his chest and rubs her face on his face. And she commands him to rise. Y'all, he did not rise. I know, I can't believe it either. Like, for a minute there, I thought, oh, you know what, she can do it, she can do it, she can do it. No, she didn't. She did not do it. She failed. William Poole stayed dead. So her excuse, which I love, again, I have a lot of time for Susanna Pearson. So her excuse was that when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he waited 4 days. Susanna had not waited long enough. And that was that. So after her failed attempt to resurrect Poole, she simply left the scene of the sacrilegious act. There is no statement from Poole's anguished mother, no statement of support from Susanna Pearson's accomplices. So in this attempt to raise Poole from the dead, Pearson was trying to perform a miracle. In the earliest years of Quakerism, they believed that miracles added substance to their ideology. They were a supposed sign of the true church. Now, consequently, the actions of radical members needed to be curtailed, or else the whole movement would be placed in jeopardy and subject to widespread, further ridicule and legal sanctions. However, in the case of Pearson, it is notable that she was never officially censured or disowned by the Quaker establishment for this grievous error of judgment in trying to perform this miracle. She fully believed that she was the conduit, the intermediary between heaven and earth. She could raise the dead with the guidance and intervention of the Holy Spirit. That light inside that could and did awaken the living could also raise the dead. The fact that she failed to raise Poole from the dead did not undermine her belief that she could do so with divine help. Incidents like this were an embarrassment to Quakers who wanted peace, acceptance, and order. It was further suggested that it was further suggested by the Quakers that Pearson had become the daily discourse and laughter of all the country. By undermining the Quakers and highlighting their inadequacies, so the author who's written this is called a sad caveat to all Quakers. The author suggested that the state church was the correct church. So there. The Quakers were not only being viewed as disruptive, but there was a palpable fear that they were dangerous and engaging in diabolical acts. They were at risk of alienating the wider population, the very people they were trying to save, with their weirdo activity, while their opponents sought to highlight such behavior and force authorities to punish them. Now, this is an extreme case, but from the start, the early Quakers threw caution to the wind. And then they'd be surprised when people would turn on them and beat the living daylights out of them. They would then make claims that they were being persecuted for their beliefs. But were they? Were they persecuted, or were they just prosecuted for disturbing the peace and breaking the law? This is the 1650s, 1660s, where the scars of civil wars are still fresh in everyone's mind. These rabble-rousers were testing the limits of social acceptability and failing. Next slide, please. But while they're in prison, Quakers were often able to write about the grim prison conditions while powerfully conveying the Quaker message. Quaker opponents were trying to undermine them, psychologically and physically. It is possible that persecuted Quakers were accustomed to severe hardship and accepted that they needed to suffer again for God. Now, during his imprisonment in Evesham, a Quaker named Humphrey Smith, who is, I will always gladly say, the historical love of my life, he wrote that there were, and this is a direct quote, I'm not being disgusting, like this is his quote. These are all his words, not mine. So he wrote that there were assaults made against us, both of the heathens and the rulers, who sought to vex us despitefully as they did. Some threw stones in the prison, the weight of 5 pounds, and threw dirt and water on my lodging, and spit on me, and pissed at me several times, and once they pissed on my food, but friends feared none of these things. There is a fearlessness there that sort of kind of admire that, right? I mean, in another prison, Smith wrote about someone throwing feces at him as well. So he really went through the ringer for his beliefs. It creates, again, another gross visual image. But this kind of writing would have served as a powerful testimony to the faith. Hey, look at how these barbarians are treating me. I'm only trying to save your eternal soul, and this is the thanks I get? Next slide. So what? Why is this important? So the Civil Wars, they managed to take a dislocated world and connect it, like I said, spread ideas. And the earliest Quakers were able to articulate their views to an audience that was dissatisfied and deeply damaged by the impact of war in a way that most other groups were unable to initiate or replicate. The earliest Quakers were rebellious. They survived their radical infancy. The early Quaker leadership, they were able to organize and adapt. The local meetings established by those first traveling ministers thrived, despite the disruptive antisocial behavior. But you know what? Those early Quakers, they did what they felt they had to do. They were zealous, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Thank you. Ready to answer questions.
Thank you so much. That was really, really powerful and visceral, especially there at the end. Before we
early Quaker writing is something else, and it's not even something I really was able to get into with this paper. But the way that early Quakers wrote, and especially if you sort of look at Quakers who wrote quite apocalyptically, like there's in sort of my research, there's a lot of casting sort of non-Quakers into a lake of fire, things like that. Yeah.
Strong stuff. Great. So we now have some time for a question and answer. So I know there are already a few questions in the chat. So if you're joining us on Zoom, there is a Q&A function. And you can also send your messages to TechHost. And Francis will help us choose some questions here. And then in the audience, I think we're just going to have folks raise their hand. We'll see if the audience online can hear you if you speak from your seat. You are also welcome to stand up here if you would like to be visible to the folks online. So yeah, I will give a little Quaker silence while we wait for either Francis to share some questions from online or some hands in the audience. All right, we see a hand in the audience. All right.
It was really interesting to hear about all those different kinds of groups that were emerging at the same time. And besides Baptists, it seems like the Quakers were really the ones that stuck. And I'm curious, like, what do you think made Quakers uniquely able to spread their message and gather a following so early and strongly?
I think that because there are so many ideas bubbling up at this time, I think, and it's sort of one of my arguments, which may or may not be controversial, I'm not sure. I think that George Fox, the early Quaker leadership, I think that they were able to cherry pick a lot of these ideas. So you can kind of see sort of like when you're sort of reading overviews of what these other groups are believing in, it's like, oh, that sounds very familiar. Oh, that sounds very familiar too. And so it was sort of like one of the analogies that I use because I love pies, and it's 'tis the season for pies, is that George Fox, Margaret Fell, the leadership, they are sort of cherry picking from all of these great ideas that are just kind of, I mean, it's such a tremendous time, like an information overload, right? And so I feel like they're cherry picking the best cherries to make this really perfect pie. And it's a pie that, I mean, obviously it wasn't palatable for everybody, but for those, I mean, but obviously it worked, right? Because Quakerism survived. And, like you said, Baptists, obviously they also survived, but so many of those early groups didn't. And obviously, so they're taking the early Quaker leadership are taking these great ideas, making it into perfect pie. But then also that's when we've got the organization and discipline. And I think that's what sets them apart from everyone else at the time, is really just how incredibly good they were at the administration part and disseminating sort of amongst from Swarthmore Hall at the earliest period, sort of the way that they're able to sort of get their message across to local meetings. It's extraordinary, really. It's a great question. Thank you so much.
Francis?
Yeah, thank you so much. I will say it's a little hard to hear the friends who are speaking in the room from behind the mic. So if people in the room can come up to share their question, I think that will be helpful. And from online, we have a question. Are there any early Quakers who talked about the trauma of the war or showed signs of PTSD?
So they certainly talk about their experience of the war, and they talk about sort of how they're really quite annoyed with the local authorities, because at the time, certainly 1650s, is that the people in power are the winning side, who are the parliamentarians. And the earliest Quakers who are coming into town, if they did participate in the civil wars, were also parliamentarian. And so they're really quite frustrated that it's like, hey, we were on the same side. Like, why are you persecuting us like this? Like, we're supposed to be brothers. And so in that sort of way, you do get a lot of correspondence. I mean, Quakers, oh gosh, they're such prolific writers. And so in this early period, you do see a lot of frustration, that these essentially sort of, can you call them brothers in arms? People that they fought with during the Civil War period, are just not having it. They're just, it's kind of like, it's like the war is over and they're enemies again. And the early Quakers found that incredibly frustrating. In terms of PTSD and early Quaker writing, I haven't found anything quite suggests something like that. But yeah, just more sort of an annoyance with local authorities sort of not being on their side, because they really felt that they really felt that there should have been this camaraderie in the 1640s, should have just carried on, and it very much did not.
Do you mind? Yeah, I have a big one. There we go, over there. If I stand here, can you guys hear me on Zoom? I'm gonna go with that, right? Yes. Yeah, I had a question sort of with two parts, but like you talked a little bit about like the role of women and how like women were allowed to be part of the public ministry, as well as like during meeting they were allowed to speak. And I'm curious, like you were also talking about how like they're cherry picking a lot of ideas from other like groups at the time. Like is that like, I guess like where does that sort of like acceptance of women come from? And then I'm also curious like how that affected their reception. Like did that make people more like wary of them, or did that help people embrace them, or like
You know, that's another excellent question. So I do think that there is, you know, for the people who are buying into the Quaker message, right? It's very, for me, I feel like it's very black and white. So, you know, the people who are sort of embracing the Quaker message think it's, for the most part, it's not everybody, but for the most part, think that women being able to preach is fantastic. Obviously, the women think it's great as well. There are some troubles later on. Nothing is perfect. How much equality did women have in the early Quaker movement? Like that's a question on itself. That's actually probably another first Monday lecture really on the early Quaker women. And so because some women, some people wanted women to just kind of have like a pastoral leadership type of function. And other women were like, no, I'm going traveling with my bestie here, and we are going abroad and being crazy. So there are Quakers very much embrace that. But then there are people like this is very, very radical. This is just far too much to allow women, to give women this kind of freedom. For these women to sort of be, to be preaching, to being traveling ministers, like they're supposed to, like women are supposed to be at home raising children. Women are also neglecting their sort of societal role. It's not just men who are up and leaving their families to go and become traveling ministers. Women are doing it as well. And so that is, women are always going to get, it's always going to be worse for women, always, throughout time. And so there is sort of that, there's that element. So that answers sort of half of your question. And then the other half is you were asking sort of what, it's like sort of, we were talking about cherry pies and cherry picking. Like there are other radical women of other faiths in this time period. It is not just Quakers. There is an excellent book that has just come out, and I think it's just come out in the US, but it's called Voices of Thunder: Radical Religious Women in the 17th Century. And it's looking at women in England, but it's by Dr. Naomi Baker. And it is an excellent book that gives a really great overview. Obviously, we've got Quaker women. So obviously one of the highlights is reading about Mary Fisher. And so we've got Mary Fisher, we also have other Quaker women, but they're situated with other radical religious women of the time. And so you can kind of see like just how women in this century are really finding their feet. And in some ways, they are being labeled as heretics and, whatever negative name you can throw at them, but they are owning their power. And so it is not just Quakers. Quakers do it really well, though. Quakers do it really, really well.
So I think unfortunately we're kind of at time. So I want to give you a moment to share some closing remarks. I'll have a few closing remarks, and then folks in person maybe can snag you for a chat before you leave. But I want to see if you have anything you'd like to end on.
Thank you so much for being such a lovely audience, and thank you for allowing me this space, and yay early Quaker history.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all who are here in Upmeets, and thank you to everyone here on Zoom. It's been a real pleasure. We've had a lot of folks, so thank you so much. I want to reiterate that we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this lecture, as well as resources like the book you just mentioned, and your book and other resources. So if you have not registered and you're here on site, please let me know. I'll get your email address. And also in that will be some upcoming events that you might find interesting, and Francis is going to put some of these in the chat, but just to verbally share, we want to highlight the spring term, which is our resident student program. This begins on March 1st and it's on campus. Students come to live for 1 or 2 months and have the opportunity to completely unplug and settle into the daily rhythm of work, study, and worship. You can learn more about that on our website. We also are having a info session with one of the teachers of the spring term, Valerie Brown. That's on December 5th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And another teacher from the spring term, Marcel Martin, who I think is also on Zoom. We'll be giving a webinar called Divine Guidance in Dreams and Images, and that'll be online on December 12th from 3 to 5. And finally, if you are interested in early Quaker history, we have a spring term elective that will be hybrid, which is really exciting. And it's called Primitive Quakerism Revived, Rediscovering Friends' Roots as a Radically Transformative Prophetic Movement. That'll be on Tuesdays, starting on March 31st. And that will be a really exciting opportunity to delve more into this time period and a lot of the early Quakers. So I encourage you to go to our website and check all that out, or come find me if you have any questions. And again, I'll just say thank you all so much for being here. And with that, I'll say good night.
Thank you.